Um, Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, COS, Dr. Jaspreet, Dr. Chintan, and the entire COS team for inviting us for the uveitis session. That is the first session of this meeting, and lucky to be here. So we are glad to have Professor Amod Gupta, sir, and Dr. Vishali ma'am as the chairpersons for this session. And Shishir will be joining me as moderator. And we have Dr. Padma Malini, Dr. Mohit as the speakers in this session. Uh, Everybody knows Sir. Sir needs no introduction, and he's mentored all of us in this session, and so all of us here from the Advanced Eyes Center. Sir is the founder, director of Advanced Eyes Center, ex dean, former dean of PGI, and Padma Shri, and so many awards to Sir. Sir, it's a pleasure to have you and have your keynote lecture on as to why should I publish. So over to you, sir.
Uh, Karima, somebody has to start I've already sent my presentation.
Hallmarks, can we have Sir's presentation?
Papers. The simplest answer to this question would be because papers are a measure of excellence, the simplest measure. And you are at the individual level, or the level of the institute, or the country, or the worldwide. All the time, people are striving to be in the top 10 in the institute, or top 100 of the institute, or the country, or the region, or the world. You want to be there where you're counted. Recently, if you are aware, the Stanford University came out with a list of scientists, the top 2% scientists of the world, for including ophthalmology, referred many a fellow. If you didn't find your name in that list, of the exalted, group of scientists. To my mind, what the science is nothing but a cumulative experience of thousands and thousands of scientists for the last few hundred years. And when you write a paper, when you publish a paper, you are contributing in a small way or in a big way or in a path-breaking way to that cumulative wisdom of the entire scientific group of the world. Now, simply when you have something to say, when you have some new observation, or you have some hypothesis, or you have some kind of a model pertaining to any branch of the sciences, and you want to say it, you need to publish it. When you write publish it, it will be reviewed by what we call a peer group of the experts who would review it for its plausibility, authenticity, for the rigor of methods, and for the conclusions drawn from that work, whether it's contributing significantly to either the existing knowledge or it's a path-breaking new knowledge. And for that to happen, you have to follow a certain standardized format, which is systematic, it's understandable, and a communicable format we know commonly as PICO format. The purpose, the intervention, what were the comparators used, and the observation and conclusion drawn from that data set which you have submitted. And if the expert peer group and the editors of the journal are convinced that you have something new to say, they will publish that paper. But why publish at all? Isn't it good enough that we keep repeating whatever is published previously? What's the standard knowledge in the textbooks? Sure enough, if you want to say or you want to talk about the existing established knowledge, you don't have to really publish it. But if you want to say something different, you want to say something new, you have to pass the touchstone of a peer group before it gets published, and it adds to the cumulative experience. And the need for publishing is because we are all humans. We are all given to making tall claims. We are all given to exaggeration. And this is not a new phenomenon. It's been there right in the beginning of the scientific world. Me too. I said it first. I observed it first. This has been challenged all along, that I was the first one to do it. And this was realized almost 360 years ago when the Royal Society of London was formed, established, and its proceedings were published just to settle this Me Too phenomena and accord priority and claims of the scientists who made that claim. And this started the modern era. Interestingly, the proceedings of the society have been published uninterruptedly for the last 351 years, to be precise. It's a very, very highly prestigious society. Only 2 living Indians currently are the fellows of this society, including one, Dr. C.N.R. Rao, who is a chemist, and much in news, Dr. Gagandeep Kang, who is a virologist, much in news these days because of the COVID epidemic. The society history is very interesting. And at that point of time, when it was set up, the start of the modern scientific era had to fight off the church and the king, because they thought that these guys are crazy. They are challenging the church and the king, which science actually had nothing to do with these. And that's how they set up this society to address all these issues, and was the motto of this society is Nullius in Verba, given in the seal of this Royal Society of London, that on the word of no one, don't believe anybody. What he says, whatever podium he says, don't believe unless he has published it. He's got through the touchstone of a peer review. Now, when you are presenting a paper, and I'm sorry to say, but less than 1% of the papers ever get published that are presented in number of meetings, hundreds of meetings that are held every year. The conference is small, regional, local, national, international. Less than 1% of those, whatever people say, gets ever published. Now, I find that as a stepping stone to a paper, because here you can test your hypothesis, you can test your observation, you can present your data to a group of experts that they're present in the audience, and they will, whether your ideas are getting resonated with experts, should propel you to write a paper about it. Now, why should one write? You should ask a young fellow or a resident or a young faculty member who gets his first paper published. The moment that paper gets published, you should see this surge of dopamine, the reward hormone that is released. It's a reward in itself. It's addictive. Over a period of time, you have 100 papers, you have 200 papers, 300 papers. It doesn't work. What works to release that reward hormone is the higher impact factor. You want to climb higher and higher. You want to see your papers cited more and more. You have 5,000 citations, you have 10,000 citations, and a person like C.N.R. Rao have 100,000 citations to their publication. That's how they reach that kind of kick that they get out of publishing their papers. So it's only the recognition, the prestige attached. The awards will follow your papers, the publications. They'll automatically follow. You're not working towards getting awards or recognitions. There are no financial gains, I must tell you that. But this has led to, somehow people trying to push poorly conducted, somehow, half-hearted research that somehow gets published. But you must realize that the half-life of such poorly conducted and published work is very short. It gets forgotten. And you must realize 1/3 of papers, even by the top scientists, never see the light of the day. They never get cited. They get absolutely ignored by the scientific community. It's a commitment. it's not something laid back. It's not a kind of a job. You have to be fully committed. It has to be, you have to have a passion for writing papers, and it must result in credible publications, credible journals. Somehow, the residents and the faculty are under pressure to publish because they count towards their either the promotion or they're getting selected as a faculty member. And there are increasing trends all over the world of research misconduct. I will not go into the details of plagiarism, falsification of data, fabrication of data, or duplicate publication. That's a lecture for another day. But I would like to, in the end, tell you the perils of the shrinking world. And this shrinking has been brought in by the all-pervasive internet. For everyone in the world, everywhere, they can reach anybody. Patients come to you even these days after checking up your biography and biodata on the network. They will be doing so, increasingly so, in the coming years. They would look at who's an expert I should need to consult. How do you become an expert? What is the definition of an expert? A person who has had at least 10 years experience and has published work in that field would be legally protected because you become legally an expert in the field when you have publications in that area. They'll come to your safety. My fear is that if you don't publish, most of my friends don't publish. They say, what is in it for me? My friend said, day may come sooner than later when you neither have papers, not the patient knock at your door, nor do you have students seeking your guidance. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We've always learned so much from you in everything that we do in clinical practice, surgical research, and we're glad to follow the practices, the ethics learned from you and taught by you. Thank you very much, sir. Next, we have Professor Vishali Gupta. Ma'am again needs no introduction. She's the head of uveitis and vitreoretina services at the Advanced Eye Center, PGI, and a huge CV. So we invite you, ma'am, for your talk on managing viral interior uveitis, results of the TITAN study.
Thank you very much, Reema. And it's a pleasure to share platform with sir. As always, it's very difficult to speak after him. And great job, Deeksha. Of course, Jaspreet and Chintan, and thank you for giving uveitis the spot immediately after inauguration, because uveitis study gets pushed to a corner of all B or C, or sometimes even later. So what I'm going to share with you the results of our first report on TITAN. TITAN is basically the infectious uveitis treatment algorithm network, which has been developed with the experts. Like sir mentioned, 10 years, we had taken 15 years of experience dedicated in uveitis as an expert. So why did we feel the need for it? So let's begin with CMV, interior uveitis. We all know that we are kind of seeing lots and lots of patients with CMV uveitis and increasing over the last few decades. Treatment typically involves you got to control the IOP, you got to control the inflammation, and suppress the for the visual acuity, because you want to give either systemic or antiviral therapy or local. Now, this is typically how the patients would present to you, with some of the very classical features showing the capies, unilaterality, increased IOP. Cluster of lesions are the coin-shaped lesions, which have been very typically described in CMV. coin-shaped lesions, cluster of nodular corneal lesions, diffuse atrophy, no synecdoche, no vitreitis, and if you check the sensation, more likely to be normal. So this is the meta-analysis, which is by the same group like we did it. It will be coming in survey to know what is the current status of CMV uveitis. And as you can see, meta-analysis has different steps, so I'm not going to get into details. But when we went into the records, depending on the websites that were used after registering it in Prospero, we found that after removing the duplicate work, we had 164 publications that reported a series of 5 or more patients. Out of 164, 133 had less than 5 patients, so they were removed, and the full text were available for 32, which met the eligibility for our inclusion criteria. Again, they were very variable, and finally, we just ended up analyzing 23 studies. There was a lot of variability, as you can see in the graph, not too much consensus, topical, systemic, intravitreal, when, how, duration. So the results of this meta-analysis eventually showed that CMV anterior uveitis commonly presents with high intraocular pressure and mild anterior segment inflammation. 2/3 of CMV endotheliitis cases present with high IOP and coin-shaped lesions that are very typical if you get to see them. Acute CMV anterior uveitis showed very good clinical response to topical ganciclovir gel or oral valve ganciclovir with a very high confidence interval and statistics I'm not going into. For chronic CMV anterior uveitis, both oral as well as topical were being used and showing good results. Topical was 0.5 to 2% ganciclovir, or you could use a combination of topical and oral. There are mixed responses and nobody knows and how to manage the recurrence of inflammation and the duration. So after writing this meta-analysis, our second step was to look at what criteria artificial intelligence mediated SUN2 has given. So SUN2 is actually said that key criteria are if you are finding the features and your PCR is positive, you will call it CMV anterior uveitis. So Titan is kind of next to SUN, because SUN dealt with diagnosis, we are going to deal with treatment algorithms. So the aim of the study was to develop evidence and experience-based consensus guidelines for the management of CMV anterior uveitis to address the lack of international agreement for this condition. The design was Delphi technique, which was two-step technique. And the participant, as mentioned previously, we contacted 100 international specialists from 21 countries who were invited to participate. 76 responded, and they were subsequently invited to complete the questionnaire first as well as second. For second questionnaire, we had 100% response. So we came up with various, statements, and I'm not going to get into all that because it's submitted to JAMA, but JAMA Ophthalmology, not to JAMA. But I'm going to just tell the flow chart because this is what I believe in, that if your paper does not help in the clinical practice, it's to me not of much, practicality. So these 2 stars indicate moderate consensus and 1 star is strong consensus. I think the problem is the viewpoint of treating of Singaporeans versus UK versus USA was entirely different. So we really had a difficulty in reaching the strong consensus. So let's see how it works. If you have a clinical phenotype where you are suspecting CMV uveitis, anterior uveitis, unilaterality, raised IOP, and other features that I have shown, You should offer patient paracentesis. Send the aqueous for at least qualitative. There was a very strong consensus to do qualitative and not so strong to do quantitative, mainly because it was not available. But there are scenarios like 6-6 vision, patient not willing, not availability. There are scenarios you may not do AC paracentesis. So these are the reasons I have mentioned: patient decline, financial burden, lack of availability, or ophthalmologist simply doesn't want to do. In that case, you could consider treatment with both antiviral and anti-inflammatory therapy as well as control IOP. On the other scenario, you did perform AC TAP. So there are three scenarios: PCR positive, PCR negative, or you still do not have the results. Now, if it is PCR negative, then you consider therapy of anti-inflammatory, control IOP, treat it as hypertensive uveitis. But there are certain further questions which we have yet to explore: is any role of AC paracentesis? Any consideration of local disease prevalence with pre-test probability? Would you do any objective testing or any empirical antiviral therapy? This part is not yet covered in this report because there was no consensus. But if your PCR comes positive for CMV, consider treatment with both antiviral, which is at least topical to begin with, and anti-inflammatory therapy. Control the intraocular pressure, and response to treatment has to be monitored clinically. There is no role of repeating PCR to monitor the response. Now, let's go to, you have treated the PCR positive for whatever duration you wanted, but the patient has recurrence, and recurrence is more than 2 episodes in 1 year. So you treat as above with similar initial doses, but the taper has to be very slow and very long, and consider long-term maintenance with antiviral as well as anti-inflammatory therapy. If it becomes quiescent, it's fine. You don't have to continue with very long therapy. If it is chronic, then you consider long-term maintenance antiviral with anti-inflammatory therapy. Now, this table here represents that what do we mean by antiviral. The first line is topical ganciclovir gel, 0.15%, 3 to 4 times a day for 1 month initially, and then taper it to BID for 3 to 12 months. There's a huge, this thing, 3 to 12, but that was the different opinions different people had. So the paper would actually have the pre-test probability, endemicity, and all those. And if you consider essential or necessary from your viewpoint, oral valganciclovir, 900 milligram BID for 2 to 3 weeks initially, and then taper to 450 milligram OD again for 3 to 12 months. Anti-inflammatory is simple predecetate with a slow taper, and anti-glaucoma topical beta blockers were the treatment of preferred choice. Now, just to give you an example of a young girl from Mumbai, seen very recently, February 2021, she was seen in Mumbai, diagnosed glaucoma, LI done, and her vision was 6/9, and she came to me only on 5th July, and you can see these pigmented KPs central. And it's very important to do specular microscopy in these patients because they do have reduced cell density. So we started her on topical ganciclovir and anti-inflammatory therapy. And you can see within 1 week, not only the vision improves, the IOP comes down, but even the cell count on specular starts improving. However, one thing to remember is IOP may not be always getting controlled, and you may sometimes have to perform surgery to control the IOP in some of these patients. So to conclude, the consensus guidelines on diagnostic strategy and classification, as well as the management of CMV and period uveitis, were kind of distilled from whatever the available evidence is and were supplemented by worldwide experience-based practice patterns of uveitis experts. So these recommendations serve as an important reference for all ophthalmologists who are treating and a platform for further research because these are consensus guidelines. These are not the results of the prospective randomized trial and all, which would ultimately be the future, but these are the interim for further research to refine diagnosis and management and provide still higher level of evidence. Thank you very much, CUS, once again for the kind opportunity and honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vishali. That was a wonderful talk on Titan and making people aware of the CMV anterior uveitis, which is such an important part of clinical practice nowadays. I think we'll have the discussion at the end of the session. So I now invite Dr. Reema Bansal to please speak on ocular manifestations of SARS-CoV infection. So we have had a lot of experience has been collected and would love to share her experience and learn from it. Dr. Bansal.
Is it seen now?
Yes, we can see it now.
Okay. So thank you, Shish, for this, for having me here. And thank you very much, Kaus, Dr. Jaspreet and Dr. Chintan for asking me to speak on ocular manifestations of SARS-CoV-2 infection. So the various manifestations that we have seen across the literature are based on various case reports, series, followed by cross-sectional studies, reviews and meta-analysis, prospective intervention studies, and some of the animal models and autopsy studies. Now, if we look at the ocular manifestations of SARS-CoV-2 infection, we have most of the common manifestations limited to the ocular surface or the anterior segment. And then subsequently, we started to have many of the reports and case series of posterior segment involvement and off late with the orbital involvement. So coming to the ocular surface involvement, conjunctivitis is the commonest presentation of SARS-CoV-2 infection, and the ocular surface and anterior segment involvement has been reported to be varying from 0.8 to 34.5%. As I said, follicular conjunctivitis is the most common, followed by viral keratoconjunctivitis. It could be hemorrhagic, pseudomembranous, and few reports of episcleritis have also been reported, which has been self-limiting. Now, finding the RNA of the SARS-CoV-2 in ocular samples, we know that there are numerous reports of its presence in conjunctival swab as well as in the tears. But coming to the intraocular fluid, there was a study where they extracted the aqueous and vitreous humor from 16 post-mortem eyes of COVID patients, did the PCR, but found none positive in any of these 16 eyes. In contrast, 14 eyes were enucleated in another study, and the viral RNA was detected in the retina of 3 out of 14 eyes. So coming to our experience, the question was, what is the rate of detection and the viral load of this virus in conjunctival swabs compared to the nasopharyngeal swabs of COVID-19 patients? So this was a departmental experience. And we did a cross-sectional study of 93 COVID-19 patients and collected their conjunctival swabs, did the RT-PCR and studied the CT values of ORF and NGene. And we found that the baseline, as obvious, baseline nasopharyngeal swabs are collected at a median of 2 days from the diagnosis, and the conjunctival swabs were collected at a median of 7 days. So there was a significant delay in the collection of conjunctival swabs. And what we found that the positivity rate in the conjunctival swabs for the RT-PCR was 18.27%. The CT values were comparable with the baseline nasopharyngeal swabs despite a significant lag between the two sample collections. So we found that probably this indicates that there is a delayed or a prolonged shedding of this virus on the ocular surface as compared to the nasopharyngeal mucosa. Now, further looking at this, it's a complicated figure, but this conveys that when we were collecting the conjunctival swabs, the patients were being monitored for repeat nasopharyngeal swabs, as was the protocol in the early days of COVID infection. And at the time when the second nasopharyngeal swab tested negative, there were patients where the conjunctival swab was positive. So this shows that probably the virus is, shed for a prolonged period of time in the conjunctival surface. Now, coming to the posterior segment involvement, as we now have increasing reports of various manifestations, the commonest and the most subtle finding are the cotton wool spots and retinal hemorrhages. And again, we have our own experience in reporting these from a prospective screening program of both patients in the acute as well as in the convalescent phase. So why we conducted this study was because the retinal involvement, fortunately, is very uncommon, and there are varying reports in acute and convalescent phase. So we did a cross-sectional study of 235 COVID-19 patients, of which 142 were screened in the acute phase, that is when they were hospitalized, and 93 were screened in the convalescent phase. All of them underwent dilated fundus screening by indirect ophthalmoscopy. And the hospitalized patients were screened at least 2 weeks after the discharge, and the home isolated patients were screened 17 days after their diagnosis. Now, what we found was none in the acute phase were detected to have any finding that was attributable to the COVID-19 infection. But among the convalescent patients, 5 patients, that is 5.38% patients, had cotton wool spots without retinal hemorrhage, with no other retinal finding. So the retinal involvement that we saw was found only in the convalescent phase of COVID-19 infection, and the hypothesis probably could be secondary to the viral immune-mediated damage rather than the direct viral infection. So this is an example of a patient where you can see there is a cotton wool spot. The patient was asymptomatic. He was screened almost 22 days after the COVID discharge from the hospital. You can see a cotton wool spot in the left eye, and on follow-up, you can see two cotton wool spots in the right eye. Another patient where there is a subtle retinal hemorrhage in the right eye, which is better seen on the red-free photograph. And there is a small cotton wool spot, again better seen on the red-free fundus photograph. So we followed these patients up in whom we detected the cotton wool spots and did their longitudinal analysis and to see as to what is happening to these cotton wool spots on OCT as well as OCT angiography. And let's take an example of this patient who had this cotton wool spot in the left eye. The OCT shows a thickened retinal nerve fiber layer, and the OCT angiography showed a decorrelation signal in all the layers, superficial, deep, outer retina, and choriocapillaris. And as the cotton wool spot regressed over a period of time, it left the hyperreflective sign, which is known with the cotton wool spots, thinning of the inner retina in the area of cotton wool spot. And this is in the other patient which I showed having cotton wool spot at first visit in the left eye. 2 weeks later, the 2 new cotton wool spots appeared in the right eye. And 9 weeks later, a third cotton wool spot appeared in the right eye. So this was all the times during screening of this patient. The patient was never symptomatic for any scotoma or floaters. And this shows that all the previous cotton wool spots have resolved. And by the 12 weeks, the right eye shows resolution of all the cotton wool spots. Now, when we followed these cotton wool spots on OCT, as I showed, there is a little bit of retinal thinning along the area of the cotton wool spot. And if you look at the OCT angiography, what's happening on follow-up, you see these dark signals, which is the decorrelation signals present at during the development of cotton wool spot. But when the cotton wool spots disappeared, all the signals were restored in all the layers as early as 6 weeks. So restoration of decorrelation signals on the OCTA indicate probably there is a mechanism which is different from the ones that is happening to the cotton wool spots of diabetic retinopathy and hypertensive retinopathy. So the other retinal findings that have been reported now and are coming up more and more with case reports and case series are central retinal artery occlusion, central retinal vein occlusion, endogenous endophthalmitis, AMN, PAM, and reactivation and inflammations and uveitis like acute retinal necrosis and serpiginous choroiditis. Now, the second wave, as we all know, produced a very devastating effect on the life of many patients, and this involved not only the systemic manifestation, but the eye was involved very badly. And our oculoplasty department, specialty from the Department of Ophthalmology and the Department of ENT from PGI made vigorous efforts to manage these patients. And some of these examples, mucormycosis was seen in patients who were diagnosed with active COVID-19 infection with an underlying uncontrolled diabetes, subjected to steroids, presenting with massive periorbital edema following fever, pain, ptosis, frozen globe, with extreme loss of vision from counting fingers progressing to light perception on the next day. Another example of a 59-year-old male, again, the same underlying conditions, presenting with frozen globe. So the implications of this finding of mucormycosis because of COVID-19 infection was quite unfortunate, and will not go into the details of the outcome of these patients. So to summarize, the prevalence of ophthalmic manifestations among COVID-19 patients has ranged from 2 to 32%. Various mechanisms have been postulated to cause these manifestations, like a direct viral infection, activation of coagulation cascade, coexisting comorbidities, various drugs like steroids, etc. The viral RNA has been isolated from the ocular surface and tissues, but its potential for being the root of infection is still under debate. So I conclude by saying that the ocular manifestations of SARS-CoV-2 may be the presenting feature of COVID-19 infection in some patients, or it may occur during the COVID-19 infection, or it may develop several weeks after the COVID-19 infection. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Reema. That was a wonderful, comprehensive talk on COVID and the way it has affected the eye and the presentations which could occur either earliest or even after the COVID infection is cleared. I think we'll carry on with the session, and it's my privilege and pleasure to invite Dr. Padma Malini Mahendra Das, who's in Narayan Nethralaya in Bangalore, to give her talk on JIA-associated uveitis, practical pearls. She has a world of experience and many publications on almost every subject in uveitis. And I would invite Dr. Padma Malini to please take over and screen share.
I'd like to thank Chandigarh Ophthalmic Society and also the entire PGI team for inviting me here today to speak on JIA-associated uveitis practical pearls. JIA-associated uveitis accounts for a sizable proportion of uveitis cases in children and is an important cause of ocular morbidity in the pediatric age group. The next 10 minutes also I would like to cover on different clinical presentations, how are you going to classify the arthritis and pathogenesis of the disease with various biomarkers and management options, including biologicals, and controversies in the cataract surgery with the recommended screening protocol for this entity. I would like to start with a case example of a 6-year female child presented to us in 2006 with the complaints of redness and pain. During the time evaluation, she was diagnosed to have a juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Those days, the terminology was JRA. Subsequently, it got changed into JIA with the addition of psoriatic enthesitis, arthritis-related and unclassified arthritis joined together form the terminology of JIA-associated uveitis. This patient was treated with topical and systemic steroids, anti-glaucoma medications, and methotrexate. Following control of inflammation, she underwent a band-shaped keratopathy removal using EDTA. Subsequently, visual axis was clear. In view of recurrences, she was added additional MMF in addition to methotrexate in 2008. However, she had multiple recurrences. In 2010, we added injection infliximab was started along with methotrexate, and subsequently, second episodes of band-shaped keratopathy was done. Totally, this child received 24 infusions of infliximab, and it was stopped in 2013. Methotrexate was continued. Subsequently, the child had typhoid. She was treated for the same, and we restarted the methotrexate in 2014. Since then, the dosage was gradually increased along with the growth. And from 2015 onwards, we are maintaining the methotrexate 15 milligram per week. So the last follow was in June 2021. She's 18 years old with appropriate anti-inflammatory therapy. We are able to maintain the visual acuity of 6/9 and N6 with the control of inflammations in both eyes. Even though this child presented with the complications with aggressive systemic immunosuppressive therapy, we are able to control the inflammation in this case. Which occurs first, JIA, arthritis, or uveitis? The uveitis may precede arthritis in 3 to 7% of children in JIA-associated uveitis. JIA-associated arthritis cases needs to be closely followed up for the development of uveitis. 86% can develop uveitis within 4 years of diagnosis of JIA. What are the types of uveitis they present with? It comes under one of the white uveitis, but they can have mild conjunctival congestion. These kids are asymptomatic and can have bilateral presentation and asymmetric involvement. Chronic anterior uveitis can be picked up by slit lamp biomicroscopic examination, and they have non-granulomatous uveitis nature, can present with complications such as band-shaped keratopathy and complicated cataract. Assessment of disease activity is done using slit lamp biomicroscopy for the estimation of the cells in the anterior chamber and also in the anterior vitreous and vitreous haze. And also we can quantify by using laser flarimetry. Here is a 6-year female child. I look quiet. When we did the screening, the laser flarimetry shows the value of 16.6. It is on the higher side compared to the normal. There are different types of arthritis JAA patients can associated with: systemic arthritis or oligoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis factor negative or positive arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, and enthesitis and undifferentiated arthritis. So we need to find out which category the kids are belong to. Oligoarticular JAA associated arthritis have uveitis in 50% of the cases. They present with fever, which is documented for 3 days, arthritis, more than one joint for more than 6 weeks, can have associated evanescent skin rash, generalized lymphadenopathy, hepatomegaly, splenomegaly, or serositis as per the ILR criteria for the diagnosis of JAA. JAA, chronic anterior uveitis, are diagnosed based on the presence of anterior chamber cells, anterior vitreous cells, can have asymmetric involvement, or they can have oligoarthritis, RA factor positive or negative, and we need to rule out other causes of uveitis. What are the risk factors? It can be in the form of acute anterior or chronic anterior. The chronic occurs in younger the age, female gender, ANA positive with oligoarticular type of JAA. Whereas male gender, enthesitis related with HLA positivity causes acute anterior uveitis. JAA is a multifactorial cause. As all we know, it's an immune-mediated disease. Various factors like genetic, environmental factors like allergy and low vitamin D level can exacerbate the uveitis. And also the disease can be mediated through T cells or B cells in the course of the disease. Coming to the treatment options, the first line is a topical corticosteroids. Prednisolone acetate is a recommended one. We start with that. And if the patient is not responding, then we go for systemic NSAIDs or non-biological DMACs or biological DMACs. Oral corticosteroids we tend to avoid because of the systemic side effects associated with these drugs in children. So coming to the non-biological DMACs, NSAIDs, naproxen is the drug of choice, followed by methotrexate in antimetabolites, rarely cyclosporin, which we don't use in children. Coming to biological DMACs, TNF-alpha inhibitors, etanercept is useful in case of arthritis, whereas it's not effective against uveitis, whereas other drugs like adalimumab and infliximab is found to be useful in treating JAA-associated uveitis. If the uveitis is refractory, then we try with IL-6 inhibitors like tocilizumab, or other drugs like abatacept, and oral Janus kinase inhibitors like baricitinib also have been tried in JAA-associated uveitis. So if it's a mild form, systemic NSAIDs can be tried like drugs like naproxen. Antimetabolized methotrexate is used as a first line of JAA-associated uveitis. 3/4 of the patients with ocular inflammations are expected to respond to methotrexate, and we can achieve a topical steroid sparing effect in 3 to 9 months of therapy. Coming to the biologics, usually they combine with antimetabolites. Local therapy, if they're not responding, in addition to the methotrexate, there are use of adalimumab has been tried in Sycamore and also adjuvant trials where the use of adalimumab. The significant effect of adalimumab on uveitis was documented within 2 months of patients with starting the therapy. If they are refractive, then they try with other medications like tocilizumab as in aptitude study. So we need to combine both. Development of anti-adalimumab neutralizing antibodies is one of the main causes for secondary treatment failure. So it has to be combined with the drugs like methotrexate. Coming to the treatment algorithm, we start with topical steroids and cycloplegic agents. If the patient has poor visual acuity, hypotony, macular edema, significant vitritis, then we add oral steroids along with methotrexate. If it's showing signs of improvement, we continue the same treatment. If there is recurrence or persistent, with the presence of inflammation, then in spite of methotrexate, we add biologics such as injection adalimumab and continue the treatment along with methotrexate and systemic steroids. We have clear-cut guidelines for the initiation of biologics in JAA-associated uveitis. However, we do not have clear-cut guidelines when to stop or how to taper. So gradual tapering is not necessary in JAA-associated cases. So but we have to take a call carefully, the decision when to withdraw the medication due to the high flare-up of rates, shorter times of inactive disease after the medicine withdrawal. We need to individualize according to the patient. Complications can occur as band-shaped keratopathy, posterior synechiate, complicated cataract, cyclitic membrane, hypertony, and ocular hypertension or glaucoma. The management of cataract is a real challenge in JAA-associated uveitis. Phacoemulsification with intraocular implantations can be tried. If the patient has less than 4 years, lensectomy with vitrectomy can be tried. And controversial regarding the IOL, however, the hydrophobic acrylic IOL in the back. Most important is adequate control of preoperative and perioperative inflammation is mandatory in these cases. So the phacoemulsification with IOL is important. Pars-plana lensectomy with vitrectomy can be combined if the disease is less than 4 years, age is less than 4 years, hypotony, fellow eye of IOL related complications or shallow anterior chamber. Here again, if the child is aphakic, then anisometropia in unilateral cases is going to be a challenge. Long-term outcome of cataract surgery in uveitis have been published by the PGI group, and they also said the PPV and lensectomy is reserved for high-risk cases, and hydrophobic acrylic IOL has tolerated well in JAA-associated uveitis with minimal posterior segment involvement. Here is a case of a 3-year female child came for second opinion. Here you could see the child is totally asymptomatic, but band-shaped keratopathy with no view. ANA is positive. This child, after starting the child on systemic immunosuppressive therapy with methotrexate and adequate control of inflammation, removal was done. Then cataract was removed by lensectomy with vitrectomy and bilateral in a sequential way. The child is doing well. Yet another case of a bilateral hydrocyclitis with polyarthritis, JAA-associated uveitis. Just here, only the cataract was done. Subsequently, the child developed cyclitic membrane, need to undergo a second vitrectomy procedure. Glaucoma can be managed with medical and surgical management. Hypertony in JAA-associated uveitis is a real challenge. And this is the screening follow various guidelines, 2 monthly intervals for the onset of arthritis up to 6 months. And JAA-associated oligoarticular type, this is the screening guidelines. If less than 3 years, up to 8 years. If more, later the age, then the lesser number of years is the follow-up. So pauciarticular, less than 6 years is 5 years follow-up is recommended. Anything above 11 years, 1 year screening in all children. Ophthalmological screening, systemic JAA, we follow once in 6 months, 6 to 12 months if there is no activity. Oligoarticular type, ANA positive, more than 4 years, screening is every 3 months. And JAA, yes. Yes, I'm just going to conclude. In control is maintained. Topical steroids should be tapered first than the systemic therapy. This is just, I will take 30 seconds more. With the COVID pandemic and JAA uveitis, here is a 19-year-old female JAA-associated uveitis diagnosed at the age of 6 using methotrexate. This is an uveitis in the right eye. The left eye is absolutely quiet. Following here, this is at presentations, and adalimumab was started 6 weeks later. There is resolution of the macular edema. When we did the FFA, we could see the perivascular leak. Other causes of uveitis was been ruled out in this case. This particular patient is 19-year-old, received Covaxin vaccine, subsequently presented with floaters in the eye, shows the presence of uveitis and the vasculitis in the left eye. So this is a vaccine-triggered occurrence of uveitis in the left eye. To conclude, JAA is the commonest cause of rheumatic disease in children. Chronic anterior uveitis is the commonest. Early introduction of systemic immunosuppressive therapy is important. Adalimumab is found to be effective in JAA-associated uveitis. It's a close collaboration with pediatric rheumatologists and ophthalmologists is important in managing such patients. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Padma, for this extensive overview on GIA-associated uveitis and sharing your experience. Thank you very much. So we now have Dr. Shishir Narayan, consultant, Shroff Eye Center, Delhi, and he's very well known for his practice in uveitis and his imaging experience And something unique about him is that he does all the fundus imaging all by himself. So he's an expert in imaging, doing imaging, interpreting and sharing his experience. Over to you, Shishir.
Hi, Rima. Thank you so much. Can you see my screen? Okay. Thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to have an academic interaction with the PGI Chandigarh, wonderful group, and I'm so lucky to be involved in activities, academic activities. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I'll share some of the practical experiences I have had with ultra-wide field imaging. So I have no financial interest. This is interesting that they had a wide field imaging study group which comprised of 11 retina specialists. And what they were trying to do was to see and define what is a posterior pole, mid-periphery, what is wide field, ultra-wide field, and pan-retinal. And it's interesting that wide field is something which is just from the posterior pole up to the ampullary vortex. And then all the 4 vortices are seen in one photograph itself. In a single shot, it becomes an ultra-wide field. And now we also have a pan-retinal photograph, which is 360-degree aura to aura, as you can see here. So various imaging options. This is an article from Uveitis Journal. And you can see here that I'll have the laser pen on. It's a 30, 40, 50, and then you have these standard 7 fields. And then here it is just short of ultra wide field, and when it becomes 200 degree, it becomes a wide field angiography. So this is the difference between a posterior polar conventional photograph and an ultra wide field photograph. What is important is that it gives you the entire panorama in one go. You can see the retinal vasculitis, you can see the CNP areas, you can see macular edema, the leakage, neovascularization can be picked up very easily. So it gives you the complete picture in one go. This is one interesting child. You can see here lesions, and these are like circular target lesions, or you can say ring of fire lesions. And the other eye has this at the posterior pole. This turned out to be a miliary tuberculosis, and you can see on the composite photograph, you can see here all the lesions. You can see the very small tiny ones over here as well. How far can you image with ultra wide field? You see, this is a pars plana photograph that has been taken, and these are exudates sitting on the pars plana that you can take. And once I had learned to take the pars plana photograph, I in fact went ahead and did an angiography of the pars plana. You can see here the hemorrhage. There's a patient with intermediate uveitis with a vitreous hemorrhage. So I've taken an angiography beyond the edge of the lens. You can see the hemorrhages are causing block fluorescence. There is early leakage here. There is a neovascularization, and you can see the increased leak. So I've gone ahead and done a laser here. You can see the laser marks. And then I have done a check FFA, and you can see the laser marks over here, and you can see that the leakage has decreased, and the neovascularization at the pars plana has come down, and the indirect laser has been beneficial. So in retinal vasculitis, it the fluorescein angiography tells you both the activity as well as the CNP areas, and you can see here that all the areas that are ischemic, only those have been lasered and the rest have been spared. So this is a 55-degree photograph, and its angiography on spectralis is a 100-degree. What I'm trying to show here is that the moment you have a picture which is larger in diameter and you have a wide view, you start to understand pattern recognition, and you can see the front petal. And this 8-year-old boy was correctly diagnosed as Behçet's. His HLA-B51 was positive, and we made a correct diagnosis. This is a very sensitive instrument. You'll see one hair, and you can see the hair over here. So it's an extremely sensitive instrument. Why I'm showing this is that I have started using the quantity of dye to be very little. What happened was, when I was using the standard dye, which we were using with a flash, I used to get a very, very hyperfluorescent image, and the details used to get smudged. When I started using lesser quantity of dye, I've almost come down to 1.5 ml instead of the 3 ml. You get a very elegant picture because you have got a very sensitive camera that is taking your photograph. So this is an SLE patient who's had a kidney disease, and I used only 1 ml, and we were able to do the angiography and get elegant demonstration. And here also, if we were to put a larger amount of dye, we would be getting a very hyperfluorescent image and lose the quality of imaging. So this is a toxoplasma, and you can see here a posterior pole lesion. But what the white field is showing you the subtle Carrelli's plaque over here and showing you a peripheral lesion that is active. And you're not just focusing on the posterior pole, you're looking at the entire picture, and you can see these features. Now these are important because you can see here fluorescein angiography, there is block fluorescence, and there is a late, again, target like fluorescence, like the ring of fire, again it's called, because there is a leak from without inwards. Now why I'm showing you this is that if you have a peripheral lesion which is confusing with ARN, then the fluorescein angiography of the periphery can be helpful. So this is an ARN. You can see here a retinitis, and you can see here a lesion where there is a pigmented patch here, and you can see an adjacent area of inflammation. And when we do the white field angiography, the same pattern that you saw at the posterior pole, you can see here. So there is an early hyperfluorescence in the area of the scar, and there is a masking in the activity area. And in the late frame, there is staining in the scar, and there is a leakage from without inwards. So by looking at the angiography picture in a atypical toxoplasmosis, I am reasonably certain that this is a case of necrotizing TRC, and it is not a case of ARN. And therefore, such helps you when you have other patients like this one. You have a peripheral lesion here, and we have boldly gone ahead and treated only with anti-tubercular treatment without giving any other empirical treatment, and it has worked. And this is the heal stage. So you can see here the Optomap is giving you a 200-degree photograph in one go. And the Spectralis, I have got 120, 100, 110. So I have had to make a montage to be able to get to that same level. But you are able to get an ultra-wide field photograph in both of them. So this is one patient which was referred as a fungal or a query, a post-operative endophthalmitis. We did the angiography. I could not come to a conclusion because there was this peripheral CNP-like areas. We couldn't make a definite diagnosis, but the patient came in follow-up with a fungating mass, and it turned out to be a lymphoma. So you can see special situations. When I started doing angiography, I had the opportunity to do post-operative cases, and we reported the first, I would say, report of ultra-wide field angiography through a gas-filled eye. In pediatric cases, this is a 5.5-year-old child, and this is an FEVR and congenital kind of a pathology, and you can quickly see the fellow eye, and you can make out that it is not a retinal vasculitis but a congenital vascular problem that is presenting. So peripheral angioma here, you can have a solitary angioma. You're seeing the vessel right from here, so we'll call it in the masquerade category because otherwise it would look like an exudate and it would confuse with a uveitis. Same here at Coats disease, you can see the abnormal development here and the collection of exudates here, and you can make a correct diagnosis. And this is angiomatosis retinae. You won't miss any lesions if you're going to treat this patient. So you can happily go ahead and treat children. And this is retinoblastoma, is actually a 5-year-old boy. So we were not sure of the diagnosis. But you could easily see on the ultra-wide field the superior as well as the seeding. We enucleated the eye, and we were able to confirm the diagnosis of retinoblastoma correctly just by imaging. So in ROP, C.K. Patel from Oxford has done a lot of pioneering work. We actually went ahead and did ROP imaging, and we published this work again in 2016. And you can see here that there is this hemorrhage, and you can surely show to the parents that the laser dye is much better, and we're able to go ahead and do the complete treatment. So I'd like to conclude by saying that ultra-wide field imaging is an elegant, comprehensive way of retinal imaging. There are no missed lesions, provided you have been able to take the entire retina, get a pan-retinal photograph. and you can get an accurate angiographic guided peripheral treatment. And it is a truly peripheral image. You can see you have even done the fluorescein angiography of the pars plana area. And I would say it's an indispensable tool for pediatric imaging in small pupils, and it's a very sensitive equipment, and you can use a much lesser amount of dye. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be part of this august gathering today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shishir, for showing wonderful cases and excellent presentation. Thank you so much. So we now move on to the last talk of this session by Dr. Mohit Dogra. Dr. Mohit is an assistant professor with us in the Advanced Eye Center in uveitis and retina specialty. He will be talking on tailored approach to a case of uveitis. Over to you, Mohit.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll just begin by sharing my screen. Is my screen visible? And am I audible, ma'am?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to thank COS for the opportunity. And I was actually asked by Chintan ma'am to speak on a tailored approach to a case in uveitis. And I know this is kind of one of the common topics I think any uveitis talk or conference or CME tends to have. To my mind, most talks I've heard on this haven't been great by lots of great people, because I think it requires a lot more time. So I'm just going to limit myself to anterior uveitis, because I don't think 10 minutes does it. And just have basic clinical clues, one slide, one case, 7 cases, and just garden variety straight up anterior uveitis cases, and what one should try and look at and try and do. So just going to begin with the first one. So you can see that that's what the patient came with. So generally, male, he had a congested eye. He was, had that hypopion. You can see with that red arrow. Had fibrin. You can, see that pretty well. You can also see, things that I've not mentioned in the box. Complicated cataract. The 360-degree posterior synechiae seems to be, well, a membrane over it as well. So maybe occlusio pupillae, but you can see that there is a distinct absence of keratic precipitates, and whatever iris is visible. And you'll have to take my word for it, there are actually no nodules. So this is, we're going to begin with something which is relatively simpler. This is a no-brainer for most people. Acutely symptomatic, people, generally males, will be youngish to middle age when they typically get it. This would be your HLA-B27 associated anterior uveitis. You have to rule out sacroiliitis, suspect HLA-B27, try and get a rheumatologist involved and do imaging for the lower back, spine, ask targeted pointed history questions, and treat both the eye and the body. And they will require, most of the time, generally some form of mild but prolonged immunosuppression, generally cilazopyrin, maybe, depending on the severity of disease, TNF, blockers. So this is what you'd see in your clinic. That's what you'd want to do. This is a little bit different. Again, a couple of these have been covered by my esteemed previous speakers. So this is, typically young girls. They present with a white eye in stark contrast to what was there in the previous patient. Also band-shaped keratopathy. You can see in the top right image, as is shown by that right arrow, complicated cataract. You can see. And you can see those synechiae, and that's typically what would bring them, to you. The parents would bring them when they notice either a whitish line across the eye, or they just get to know in school that the kid's not seeing that well, or the vision's actually going in and out. Just a pointer, and I think Dr. Padmamadani also alluded to that. And for the most part, these are white eyes. I mean, as in they will not be circumcorneal or conjunctival congestion, maybe mild conjunctival congestion in few. But in the rare circumstance that they develop that they present to you, with extremely high pressures in iris bombae, they could have a red eye. That would be secondary to their, raised IOP, because then the eye would look a lot like acute congestive glaucoma eye would look. So once you do that, I think it's a no-brainer. It's GI associated. I'm not going to get into too much. Ma'am did an excellent job of doing the explaining for me. I think what needs to be done is, especially those who come with borderline low to low IOPs, especially with complicated cataracts, and if you're planning any surgical intervention, a UBM is must, because you might pick up something like that. So the first picture there shows you a flat bald ciliary body without ciliary processes and the hyperreflective membrane, which is a cyclitic membrane, and that's the intraoperative view of the same. You can see, all of that white kind of plastered cement, if I can use that, at the back of the eye is the cyclitic membrane, and that kind of changes the entire A, treatment paradigm, and B, prognosis for the patient, but must be done with borderline or low pressures in any of kids with this kind of presentation. We'll jump quickly to the third case. So, if someone comes like that, some congestion in the eye, has iris nodules, you can see that red arrow, that's a big Quepe nodule, has mutton fat KPs, the blue arrow shows you great, you have certain smaller ones, but I've pointed the really large mutton fat glaring one. You can see the Berlin's nodules, which are not that commonly seen, but you can see it in that patient. It's actually a green arrow there in the angle. And if you were to do a gonioscopy, you'll be able to see it better, but you can even see it with the patient looking down on the slit lamp. And there are broad-based posterior synechiae, the black arrow. What pretty much that tells you, and this is all clinical, when you look at the patient in the clinic, that this is a granulomatous anterior uveitis. And given our setup, our scenario in our part of the world, with, this constellation of features, you could maybe not have one or two, but if you have mutton fat KPs and or you have iris nodules, and especially if you have those angle nodules, you need to look at TB sarcoid. If you have angle nodules, single or multiple, I think sarcoid takes precedence. But the idea is to try and work the patient up for any one of these two, and not try and get your HLA-B27s and X-ray or MRIs for the lower back in these patients. Again, something similar, looks a little bit similar to what we just saw in the previous patient, except that this patient has segmental iris atrophy. Bottom picture, you can see that green arrow showing it. The rest of the iris appears fairly okay, but that's segmental or patchy iris atrophy, whatever word you want to call it. You have pigmented keratic precipitates. You can see them smaller size there. This is a different patient, mind you. And you can see some larger ones there, and you can also see some Busakas nodules. So this is a granulomatous uveitis. The IOP may be high in a little above a third of these patients. There might be overlying corneal opacity, may or may not be there. I don't think this is a clinical diagnostic dilemma. I think most people would get it. This is herpetic. Whether it is HSV, VZV, or CMV is a topic for another day. And but the idea is to know what it is. But what is of paramount importance is, even if patient has no complaints, you must do like any other patient, but doubly sure, and because sometimes these eyes will be congested, there'll be some corneal edema because of IOP, and you might not be able to get a good view. But in a couple of days, 3-4 days, once you get the pressure down, you have a good view. You must look at the posterior segment and do a dilated peripheral indirect ophthalmoscopic examination, because they might present with very good vision, but have these lesions in the periphery. And that's pretty much a medical ocular emergency, with patients requiring immediate admission and treatment, if not just very aggressive treatment. We're just going to come to something a little less sinister than medical and ocular and emergency. This is something more similar to what we just saw. So this patient has diffuse iris atrophy. You can see that this loss of the iris pattern, your rugae are gone, all of those gutters and troughs are that well made out, but it's diffuse. It's in one eye, it's all over. There are these stellate keratic precipitates. You can see them also on the anterior segment OCT on the back of the cornea, and they're present all over the endothelium. IOP may be high. There are absence of posterior synechiae. I think the emphasis of that cannot be overestimated, no matter how many times you say it. What it also signifies and tells you is that the breaking of the blood ocular barrier is not to that degree. Hence, there are no synechiae. There might be posterior subcapsular cataract. So no brainer. This is the clinical diagnosis. This is Fuchs heterochromic uveitis, or iritis, or iridocyclitis, whatever you want to call it. And this is a clinical diagnosis. There are no labs or intensive investigations needed, apart from dealing with the cataract and or dealing with the glaucoma, or dealing with both. I'm just going to come to the second last of my cases, and this is, we just saw a white eye. So 5-year-old girl, white eye, you can see it's a white eye. She had trauma to her right eye with a wooden stick about 1 month ago. She advised cataract surgery with IOL implantation elsewhere. And I remember a father walking into my clinic. This is in the in the middle of the first and second wave of COVID, so not too long ago, maybe a little over 6-7 months, and wanted a second opinion. She came from interior Punjab. That's what he had. Sorry, that's what she had. She had acuity of 3/60, IOP of 28, and that's the blown up picture on the right. Right, mind you, she was advised cataract surgery and so she has these large flocculent cells which look a lot like typical lens matter in the AC. But what you do well to recognize is if once that slit lamp photo is taken, you can see that the anterior capsule is not breached. So it's not like the lens, and the lens is clear. So you can see that on the slit lamp. You can see those cells. You can also see those cells not just settled inferiorly, but also along there. So you can see that they've been mobile. That's what the patient had. So initially, essentially what this patient had was a white eye, large mobile flocculent cells. There was some material back there. So you could have thought trauma. This could be endophthalmitis. This is not. This is a masquerade, no synechiae. One must rule out a retinoblastoma in these patients. Diffuse infiltrating type might not have a mass lesion, might not have calcification. This kid did. But the idea is that, that's the anterior uveitis that you want to do. So for this patient, there is no ANA, no HLA-B27s, nothing. There is a good posterior segment examination with or without an ultrasound. And depending on how good or bad your thing is, either an MRI of the eye or best a cytology so that you can demonstrate cells and try and save the patient's life. I'm just going to finish with one, this is my last slide. As I said, I'm just going to stick to anterior segment cases. So this patient actually presented with this. I think, again, the diagnosis is writ large on the photo. Painful red eye, pains, the symptom, discharge, the lids are actually sticking together. There's uveal show, there is some inflammation there. So you could have peripheral ulcerative keratitis or interstitial keratitis. Again, it's a no-brainer. It's necrotizing scleritis with uveal show, generally happens secondary to GPA, can also occur secondary to surgery. But you can have necrotizing scleritis post-surgery as well, although that scenario and that history is different. And what you need to do for these is look at your C-ANCAs, and these are medical and medical emergencies and life-threatening illnesses. This patient actually had an eroded septum and C-ANCA positivity. That's your fluorescent things. So again, just wanted to show these 7 cases and highlight what garden variety cases that one would tend to see in the clinic, but what one should try and do in these scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohit. That was a wonderful talk, and you brought out all the common conditions which we should miss. Can I request the senior faculty, all the members, to kindly unmute so that we can have a quick discussion on some of the points. There are no definite questions I see in the chat box. Is that correct? Rima, are you there?
There is one. I think, I don't know, for whom. When do you advise to put secondary IOL after open lens? Is it for us? I don't understand the question, but there is one in Q&A box.
Vishali, I have a question for you, if you will allow me. And the question is relating to CMV uveitis. You nicely presented data about what we used to call Posner-Schlossman syndrome, or the acute CMV uveitis. But I guess that the Singapore group, the Soonfek group, believes that Fuchs uveitis is a chronic manifestation of CMV uveitis. So, 2 parts of my question is, do you see that Fuchs uveitis we see a lot? Have you done any PCR for detecting CMV in these patients, or is it an immune phenomena to CMV? And how did Soonfek prove that this is related to CMV? The second question is, they said this doesn't need treatment, So how many of your, experience, like in Delhi with Shishir Narayan or with Bangalore, or you have experience of this Posner-Schlossman versus Fuchs uveitis?
whatever Forstner-Salzman, we have seen quite a few patients with the CMV uveitis. Fuchs is very, very rare, maybe a couple of cases, but most of the times Fuchs, what we investigated, came negative for the PCR, except a few cases of rubella we had, herpes simplex we had, but CMV was very less.
No, for the Fuchs, you have very less CMV, but the Boston-Schwarzman, you have PCR positivity for CMV.
Yes, yes, sir.
And same is true in
yes,
North India.
Patient presents with Forstner-Salzman, and initially couple of patients, when we did, it came negative. We followed up these patients over few years down the lane. 3 years, 4 years later, the repeat PCR came positive for CMV.
Okay.
But I agree. Regarding your question, sir, the first part, Sunfik has shown them on quantitative PCR, and she's the only one in the world who's doing quantitative PCR repeat after the therapy to see response to therapy and to decide when to stop or reduce the medication, which other experts did not agree. And the second part of your...
No, are people elsewhere in the world seeing CMV like what Padma Malini says? Are you guys also seeing, or elsewhere in the world they're seeing PCR positive CMV uveitis?
They are seeing. That is why SUN2 has come up with the criteria that any patient with uveitis, raised dioptry, unilateral, if it is PCR positive for CMV, it's a criteria for CMV uveitis. So
versus herpes, how common is this?
So herpes is mostly bilaterality. Herpes has more of atrophic spot, which CMV...
No, not clinical. PCR versus...
PCR,
like PCR for herpes anterior uveitis is pretty high sensitivity. But for what about CMV?
Not for Forstner-Schwarzman. That is particularly CMV which is coming positive. And regarding the treat or not to treat, patients who were not being treated are showing now over years the disc changes because the glaucoma tends to be progressive. So by and large, now there is consensus that if you are suspecting CMV, even if there is a very mild inflammation, you still should treat for taking care of glaucoma management as well, besides the CMV component, which is inflammation. Regarding the Fuchs, that is more of rubella reports than CMV. Other than Sunfik, nobody is reporting CMV in Fuchs. We tried doing it in some patients, it never came positive, and then 1 or 2 patients came TB positive. Then I got very confused and I didn't know what to do.
No, what does your group, the Titan group, believe? That is there something like CMV related Fuchs uveitis?
The Titan group does not have much of Fuchs related. They all felt that उनके Fuchs के patient में CMV नहीं आता. CMV they suspect only when high pressure is there with any form of uveitis.
But they are all seeing, even in the US, they are seeing this Boston-Schwarzman like picture with CMV.
From US, we had about 4 or 5 centers. They are not seen as much, like Jill Rosenbaum doesn't see much of virus, but Deborah Goldstein, where she has a lot of mixed population, I must say. Deborah has seen a lot of cases, and she says she does PCR as a routine. Jim says he doesn't do PCR, but then either Andrew Dick sees a lot, Carlos sees a lot, but there are few, like Nick Jonas said, I don't see. So there is, I think, either the problem with the recognition or the availability of the PCR or the population density, like which kind of population are you dealing with. So still we do not understand, but overall the consensus was that if you have, you should treat it with topical, and if it is becoming recurrent, then you should add oral treatment to it. But all of them agreed that since oral valganciclovir could be toxic and of course expensive, it should be done only in PCR positive or in recurrent episodes, not in first episode.
Good, thank
and following Titan, like Titan was almost 1 year ongoing, I have started now treating after listening to Sunfit only. Topical ganciclovir drops instead of gel. They work very well actually. The pressure and all by and large responds very well to.
So can I make a comment?
Sir, I also have a similar experience, and very interestingly, I have a patient with HIV who has got CMV uveitis, and that is very typical, like the Posner-Schlossman syndrome type. In fact, I had sent that patient to PGI, and we could not correctly diagnose. And then when I went ahead and I was doing a trabeculectomy, on the pre-operative workup, we found the CMV to be positive. And then the partner of the patient, who also became HIV positive, also developed CMV anterior uveitis, and a very typical Posner-Schlossman syndrome, both the people have. So, and it is not responsive to the treatment. So, sir, the entity definitely is there, CMV anterior uveitis.
Shishir, did you report
Sorry?
this patient? Did you write a report on this patient?
Sir, is still not yet, sir. But after your talk, I'm encouraged to do that.
CMV anterior uveitis in a HIV positive patient would make news.
To the part
What was the CD4
Yes, I
count,
have.
Dr. Shishir, in your case?
I will not be able to tell you offhand, and I'll not give you a wrong answer. But what was very surprising was that when he brought his other partner who became HIV positive, and they both of them only have CMV anterior uveitis. So there could be a subset of a viral load, something that could, that some particular type of a virus that is causing it.
So is CMV it's actually transmitted disease? Is it a STD? HSV is HSV2,
but I have this patient, and it can come to, both of them can come and show you, because they have already been seen once there at PGI, and we can photograph them, and they are very typical CMV anterior uveitis, both of them.
It's a very interesting.
With endothelial changes, pigment on the endothelium, and very, very high pressures. And the trabeculectomy picked them up, because we were going to go ahead with surgery, and pre-operative workup includes HIV.
How do you acquire CMV infection?
It's a ubiquitous infection, sir.
No, how?
I think it's a...
Is it contact, or is it through inhalation, or how do you get it?
Inhalation, liquid, water, food, anything, sir. I think it's a very easily acquired infection.
But it's not STD.
Yes, it's not STD. And this is very, very interesting.
Yeah. Who knows, it might be. If two of your patients have.
Yeah, he might have. Worst case,
and interestingly, that is the only manifestation of the patients.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, very interesting.
So we are using the confocal in CMV anterior uveitis to titrate a treatment. Every time the PCR is not possible, it really helps us to see the disease course, when to titrate the treatment, and also to plan to stop the treatment. So
that's what you see, the owl eye. Is that right?
So owl eye, except in one case we did not find, but we saw central globular with dendritic infiltrative infective pattern of keratic precipitates in CMV anterior uveitis. Owl eye, so far we have seen in only one case. It's not seen in all set of.
We also did not see much of owl eye, though I keep looking for them, but hardly one patient, that too long time ago.
So I'm sorry, I'll interrupt. It's 3:56. We hand it over to the next session. We hand it over the hall. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Pleasure listening to you. Thank you, Shishir, for co-moderating. I'm sorry I lost on the internet connection, so I was lost somewhere. And thank you, Padma and Mohit, for your wonderful talks. Thank you, Kos, once again for beginning with uveitis. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nice meeting you.
Thank you.
Thank you.